Theodore and the Christmas Mystery by Father Kevin Mackenzie. "Oh no!" shouted the boy. "Baby Jesus is missing!" Let's rewind a little. Once upon a time there was a boy named Theodore. The snow lay thick on the tree branches outside Theodore's bedroom window. It was Christmas Eve. "Theodore," came a voice from the bottom of the staircase. "What is it, Mom?" Theodore replied, without looking up from the desk at which he sat. "Time for dinner." "Not now," Theodore said to himself. On his desk sat a pile of wires and Legos. Ignoring the summons from his mother, he fiddled with the wires, trying different combinations. He had a small computer called a Raspberry Pi, to which he kept attaching and detaching the wires. Motors and gears and lights were strewn across the desk. Cannibalized cell phones were heaped on one corner, while on another sat a soldering iron for melting metal and attaching wires, still smoking with heat. "Theodore." This time the voice came from the doorway of his room. "Mom, I'm almost finished," he said, still focused on his work. "I've really got something this time and it should be working by now." "No one will steal your masterpiece," said his mother, who had gently lifted him from his chair and was now guiding him out of his room. "It's Christmas Eve, Theodore," she said. All through dinner, Theodore couldn't keep his mind off the project on his desk. Was it my code, he thought? Or something in my wiring? Micro-soldering is really tricky. Did I do it right? "Theodore! Theodore!" The boy looked up from his food and his thoughts. "What's wrong with you?" asked his little sister. "We've been calling your name and you're just staring at your mashed potatoes." "Theodore," said his father, "we've been going around the table telling the Christ child what we're grateful to him for from this last year. It's your turn now." "Yeah, like maybe the fact that you're still alive after crashing your rocket bike," said his sister. "Or that you're not in jail for selling fake lemonade," said his brother with a snort. Theodore trailed off. His father's words still bounced through his head. Grateful to him for the number 4, the 4th USB slot. "That's it," he shouted, jumping from his chair. He raced through the doorway of their dining room and headed for the stairs. As he rushed into his room, he could hear shouting and laughter from the family down below. "The 4th slot, that's gotta be it," he said, sliding into the chair at his desk. Unplugging several of his wires, he rerouted them, careful to plug the thick red cable into the 4th USB slot of his Raspberry Pi. "Theodore, come down here this minute," boomed a voice from below. It was his father calling. "Coming, Dad, just give me a second," he replied as he plugged his contraption into the wall. His father heard the "coming, Dad," but he never heard him finish the sentence. Theodore had watched as his little device booted up, and then it worked. His time travel machine had worked, and it had shot him straight to the time and place he had pre-programmed into it just hours earlier for fun. 24:00, 12/24/0000, 31.702580523 degrees north, 35.204582515 degrees west. Stretched out before him was a dark desert. He could see shapes of different sizes sticking up from the ground. They seemed to be bushes. On his right sat a huge boulder. "I didn't think it was really going to work," he said to himself in awe. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he marveled at what he saw above. Points of light, tiny stars, littered the night sky in glorious splendor. Wow. As his eyes looked up higher, he saw one star shining brighter than the rest. "It's true. It's all true," he said. Turning his gaze back to earth, he looked for what he knew would be there. Light. Not anything dazzling, just a simple flame. Off in the distance, many lights gleamed from a small city. "That's not it," he said. He spun around but still couldn't find his light. "Oh yeah," he said, laughing to himself. He tilted his head back and gazed up to the sky. There again was the star, the very bright star. He remembered what his dad had said the night before about a star. He didn't want a palace. But what king had a star announce his birth? The star was there, almost directly above him, shining through the night for all to see. But it wasn't directly above. It was on the opposite side of the city from him. Using his finger to draw an arc downward through the sky, he saw it. A warm yellow light was pouring from farther down the valley in which he stood. Gugu was pretty close, he said to himself, setting off in the direction of the light. It was only once he started moving that he felt his body shivering. The adrenaline that had started pumping into his veins as he ran up the stairs from dinner had made him oblivious to the cold until now. Wish I would have remembered to bring my jacket. He thought back to earlier that day, to the moment when he had picked his coordinates. It had started with doubt. The night before, the family had been talking about Christmas, the first Christmas. Why would God choose to be born in a stable? He had asked his parents. I mean, he's God. Couldn't he have been born in a palace or something? His parents had told him about God's humility, and Theodore had accepted their answer. But he still wondered. And when he got to the part of programming where he needed to insert the coordinates in his time travel machine, he had gone downstairs to the family computer and typed in GPS coordinates, Bethlehem. This thing will never work, but anyway, I still would love to see it for myself, he had thought. 24:00, 12/24/0000, he had typed in for his time and date. As he now walked closer to the flickering light, he saw that it came from an opening in the rock. It's a cave, he said. Just then he heard voices coming from his right. He froze in his tracks. There was a group of people carrying lanterns and chattering excitedly. They were pointing and speaking and seemed to be in a hurry. They rushed past Theodore without even noticing he was there. Theodore did notice that while all of them wore robes, a few of them were carrying bundles. He saw two small eyes gleaming from one bundle. Sheep, he thought. As swiftly as they had come, they were now gone, heading off in the direction of the cave. But then Theodore heard footsteps, coming from the right again. A small boy came into view. He was wearing robes and was carrying a bundle as well. Theodore thought that the boy wouldn't see him just like the others hadn't, but then the boy stopped. Theodore could see that the boy's bundle didn't have any eyes. It was hay, a big pile of grass. Hay for the sheep of the others. The boy looked at Theodore for a moment, and then, without saying a word, nodded his head in the direction the others had gone, as if to say, "Come on, chap, this way." Theodore set off at once. As they walked, he glanced at his new companion. The other man had worn hats of sorts, but this boy was bareheaded. Bare were his feet, too. Soon they caught up with the rest of the group who had stopped outside the cave. Theodore followed his new friend around the men and up to the open side of the cave. That was when he saw the scene he had heard and seen 1,000 times, so different here and yet so familiar. A warm glow was coming from a lantern held by a man who stood inside the cave. The man was tall and a huge smile covered his face. He had a beard, but not a gray one like in the paintings Theodore had seen. His was a deep brown beard, and he looked strong and in the prime of life. Animals there were too. A cow of some sort, chickens, yes, a donkey. But that wasn't what really caught Theodore's eye. A very young woman sat, eyes intent on something in her arms. Just then she looked up at the men, the shepherds, who stood round in silence. Her face was radiant as the lamp so close at hand, if not more. Years later, Theodore would remember that face, that look. It was more than a smile, that's all I can tell you, he would say. As the woman then held up what was in her arms, gasps escaped the mouths of the shepherds. Some cast themselves to the ground, while others stretched out their arms and sang. It was one of these arms that blocked Theodore's view, so he couldn't see what he knew was there. It was the woman's baby. The next thing he knew, it seemed, the woman had passed her child to the arms of one of the shepherds, who kissed him with a fierce shepherd kiss, then held him up as if offering him to God. The whole group of shepherds became more and more animated as the baby was passed around. I hope I get to see him, Theodore thought. But then the shepherds had started to dance. They danced and sang and continued to pass the baby around. Theodore tried to keep up, but he couldn't understand what they were saying, and soon he lost sight of where the baby was. All of a sudden, a shout went up. Then another, then more. Theodore couldn't understand what they were saying, but he did know one thing. Something was wrong. The whole celebration had turned to mourning. The shepherds rushed this way and that. Theodore could see the woman and the man inside the cave look at each other in alarm. "Oh no," he said. He shouted, "Baby Jesus is missing." Was it me, he thought? Did I destroy everything by coming here, by time traveling? Did I throw off the space-time continuum? Oh, I wish I had never made my time machine in the first place. I wish I never even knew what a computer was. Theodore would have stayed there lamenting had a little bell not gone off somewhere in his head. I haven't seen my new friend for a while, he thought. Shaking himself from his inaction and ignoring the shepherds rushing this way and that, he started to look around. The last place I saw him was over here, he thought, by the side of the cave. He walked over to the place. There was hay on the ground. And not only was there hay where the boy had stood, but there was more hay leading away from the spot. Theodore followed the trail. It led him back the way he had come, all the way back to where he had first set foot in Palestine in 0 AD. He remembered because he saw the big boulder he had first stood by. And on the other side of the boulder, he saw what he had been looking for from the beginning. There, his back leaning against the boulder, sat his little shepherd friend. He still held his bundle of hay, minus a bit, but in the middle of the hay lay something else, a tiny baby. In the midst of all the noise and singing and dancing, the boy must have carried off the baby Jesus without anyone noticing. Theodore slowly walked over. His friend looked up, smiled at him, and then looked back at the baby. Theodore sat down next to him in the sand. The baby's body was wrapped in a cream-colored cloth. His little hands were drawn into two tiny fists, and he laughed, tiny little baby laughs, as the shepherd boy smiled down on him. Theodore watched as the boy gave the little baby a kiss. It was nothing big, nothing grand. It was only a little kiss for a little baby. But then, for the first time that night, Theodore heard his shepherd friend speak. If the boy's smile could have become any larger, it did. Though he spoke in a tongue Theodore couldn't understand, Theodore did understand what had just happened. The boy had been mute all his life, and when he kissed baby Jesus, he had received the gift of speech. Though awestruck, Theodore remembered why he had come. He tugged at his young friend's arm and gestured back towards the cave. "We need to bring the baby back to his mother," Theodore said. The boy seemed to understand. Carefully rising to his feet, he followed Theodore back to the cave. As they drew closer, the shepherds came into view. Theodore thought that they might be angry at his little friend. His body tensed up. But as they approached, instead of anger, Theodore saw joy. His friend, the young shepherd, had been singing ever since they had started back toward the cave, and the miracle of his newfound voice must have struck the shepherds with awe. They bowed from either side as the two boys passed. Then the two arrived at the cave and stepped inside. The young woman wasn't angry either. In fact, she beamed at both of the boys. She too seemed to understand the miracle that had happened, for as she took the baby again into her arms, she nodded to the man holding the lantern. "That's Mary, And that's St. Joseph, thought Theodore. And this is so totally not happening right now. And yet it was. Theodore had not messed things up this time. What he had done was help baby Jesus work his first miracle. And as he stood there, grinning from ear to ear, the most shocking thing of all happened to him. The young woman looked into his eyes and then, leaning over, held out the baby. "For me?" Theodore asked. He thought of the doubts he had had about all of this. He remembered how he had been disobedient and not come down to dinner when his mom had asked. All his mistakes and all the trouble he'd gotten into the last year passed before his eyes. But it all disappeared when he felt the weight of the tiny baby in his hands. Never before had he held such a treasure. As the shepherds and Mary and Joseph and his young shepherd friend watched, Theodore held the baby close to his chest and gazed into his eyes. There was no judging, no rejection, no, who is this character who is so out of place? There was only acceptance there, and joy, and love. I felt like he knew me, and yet he loved me, completely, wholly, Theodore would recall later. Just a tiny baby, and yet Almighty God. I kissed him, and if that's the only thing I ever do my whole life long, I'm at peace. The rest of the night passed all too quickly. Theodore ever so gingerly handed the baby back to his mother. Then, along with the shepherds, he watched in rapt attention as the young woman sang a lullaby to the little child. As the baby's eyelids became heavy, all the shepherds joined in, humming the same lullaby in unison with Mary. And though he didn't know their language, Theodore too, he sang that same lullaby together with them all. He had programmed his device to bring him back home exactly 1 hour after he left in case of emergency, and that it did. His last memories were of the baby's eyes closing, of his mother gently laying him in a manger filled with very soft hay. Theodore was thinking he had an idea where the hay came from as the scene disappeared and he stood in his own room once more. "Theodore!" boomed a voice. He had set the device to bring him back home precisely 1 second after he left, and so it was quite a shock to go from a quiet lullaby to his father's voice calling him back to the dinner table. But Theodore was happy to be home. He unplugged his time machine, bounded down the stairs, and plopped back in his seat next to his father. "What was that all about, young man?" his father asked, arms crossed, eyeing his son. Theodore smiled. "Now I know," he said with a laugh. "Now I know what I'm grateful to baby Jesus for." The end. Merry Christmas.